Yes, and this crucial distinction now comes to the fore between a ceasefire on the one hand and a peace deal. Could it be that what we're really seeing in Qatar, as you mentioned, is desultory discussions towards a ceasefire, which frankly haven't got very far yet? They reconvene this evening. And the real business in town, though, being in Washington, where obviously the President of America, Donald Trump, and the Israeli Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, sitting down to dinner. There, we could, in theory, get some sort of peace deal or the beginnings thereof. Now, the protesters who gathered here, they're not interested in a ceasefire, temporary 60-day thing where some hostages come out, Palestinian prisoners also come out, the aid gets better, and then, frankly, it falls apart and the whole thing is worse than it was before. And I have to tell you, over 100 people killed today by Israel's continuing onslaught in Gaza just in the past 24 hours. No, they want it over, they want the war over, all the hostages out, and they want Benjamin Netanyahu and Donald Trump to deliver that, and frankly, start delivering it tonight. Under the blazing sun, facing off the seafront US Embassy here tonight. They're conflicted, perhaps. The mood raised by Trump's optimism that a peace deal is on the line, let alone a mere ceasefire. And yet, the mood music coming from peace talks in Qatar, dismal, hardly upbeat. Shivia Bada moved to tears, and her words surely spoke for almost everyone here tonight.
What's your message? Why come here today?
Because we need to scream to the world, and President Trump especially, end this war and bring them home back now. He's the only one who can solve this situation. We know our government doesn't want to do everything in order to bring them home. We can't have 50 people in Gaza for almost 2 years. It's an impossible situation.
On-stage appeals to Washington, to Trump, to Netanyahu to move and bring all the hostages home.
President Trump, you stood by us to win against Iran, but there's no bigger win than saving lives. That's real leadership.
Good chance of a deal this week, said Donald Trump breezily last week. Too late for 57,000 Palestinians, mostly civilians, now killed by Israel in 640 days of war. A figure aid agencies say, which is likely to be an underestimate. Overnight then, another Israeli airstrike, this time on an unused medical facility in Gaza City. People made homeless by Israel's bombing had been sheltering here. One man from nearby, himself already homeless, left pondering the men in suits who talk of peace but do not deliver.
I ask God Almighty that the negotiating delegation or the mediators pressure with all their strength to solve this issue, because it has become totally unbearable. We as citizens, I swear to God, we can't bear anymore.
Local medics say at least 6 people were killed here.
The genocide war against our people in Gaza is still ongoing. In 24 hours, just at the Al-Shifa medical complex, 51 martyrs and more than 80 injured. The injured came from areas where people are displaced.
One, having lost a relative here, now all but lost for words.
Truce? We've been hearing of a truce since October 7th. There is no flesh or body left in us, no soul left in us, and nothing more to say.
And today in the ruins of Gaza, the gulf in the Gulf still feels vast, as round 1 of peace talks in Qatar ended without breakthrough. Israel demands an end to Hamas as a fighting and governing entity and all hostages out, alive or dead. Hamas demands complete Israeli withdrawal from Gaza and a permanent peace deal, not a temporary ceasefire. It leaves Trump and Netanyahu in Washington looking like conductors without an orchestra. Israel, though, believes it has other fronts and other unfinished business. Overnight, its Air Force bombers prepare and leave on sorties for Yemen. A number of locations attacked. Israel claims it's targeting Houthi rebels who are firing missiles at Israel. The message from Yemen, defiance and the promise of a long war.
We are fully prepared for a sustained and prolonged confrontation to face down hostile warplanes and to counter attempts to break the naval blockade imposed by our armed forces on the enemy in support of our people in Gaza.
But back on the beach in Tel Aviv tonight, vast banners spell out "Save the hostages, end the war," to be read by passing planes. But they know better than most, these people here, that Prime Minister Netanyahu has been here before, has had a ceasefire before, and then turned back to war.
So what can we expect from Donald Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu when they meet for the third time this year at the White House later? Let's cross to our correspondent Andy Davies in Washington, D.C. Andy.
Kathy, the news right at the moment here is being dominated by those awful events still unfolding after the flooding in Texas. So the Israeli Prime Minister's overnight arrival in Washington has been somewhat overshadowed by that. But this is his third visit to the White House in the last 6 months, and some think that it could be the most consequential yet. He'll be meeting Marco Rubio, the US Secretary of State, in a couple of hours, Steve Witkoff, the US envoy to the Middle East as well. And incidentally, Witkoff will be traveling to Doha to join those ceasefire negotiations later this week. That's just been announced. Then there'll be a private dinner this evening with the President in the White House, and perhaps we might get a sense then of whether there's going to be any movement on Gaza. But, you know, whether this is a consequential visit or not, what it will surely be full of is mutually assured flattery, with both leaders treating this as something of a victory lap after their actions in Iran.
Well, Donald Trump has again predicted a ceasefire deal this week. How likely is that?
Well, he's very impatient for it, and if these two leaders have designs on using this moment with a weakened Iran as some sort of inflection point to reshape the power dynamics in the Middle East, then they know that Trump knows that he has to stop the bloodshed in Gaza first. He's on a good run. He's had a good run of late in Congress, in the Supreme Court, in his dealings with NATO, and he knows that Netanyahu owes him one. He's been arguably putting a lot of his political capital on the line for Israel, with the US joining those strikes in Iran. So he's going to be expecting something in return. But whether the two sides in this conflict, who are so vastly at loggerheads and unable to bridge their differences, whether they can deliver for Mr. Trump, for President Trump, well, then that's another matter entirely.
Andy, thanks very much. Well, joining me now are the Israeli hostage negotiator Gershon Baskin, who's in Jerusalem, and Sarah Yerkes, who's in Washington. She's a former member of the US State Department's policy planning team and now works on the Middle East program at the Carnegie Endowment think tank. Gershon Baskin first. I feel like I've asked you this question many times over the past few weeks, but, you know, Donald Trump says he wants a deal this week. It's going to happen. How close do you think it is?
Well, it's very difficult to predict anything with Donald Trump, but we have to remember that when Donald Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu sit down at the dinner table, it is not a conversation or a negotiation between equals. Israel is completely dependent on the United States, and if Donald Trump wants this war to end, he will tell Benjamin Netanyahu that it has to end, and he has to bring the hostages home. Trump indicated today that they're talking about a partial deal, but he's been under pressure from the hostage families and from others, his envoy as well, Steve Witkoff, to make sure that this deal is a complete deal that brings all the hostages home and ends the war. There's no point to a 60-day ceasefire that brings home half the hostages and releases some Palestinian prisoners. It's really time, after almost 21 months, for this war to end. Trump knows it, and he can do it.
Right. Well, Sarah Yerkes, Trump knows it, he can do it. Is he going to put pressure on Netanyahu, enough pressure to bring this to a close?
I think he'll certainly try, but I think what we need to remember is that these two gentlemen have very different incentives, and they're coming at this from very different positions. You know, when you look at Trump, he's really motivated by the desire to get a Nobel Peace Prize. He's made that clear. He wants a deal. He doesn't care what that deal looks like. For Netanyahu, this has to be a win for him politically. He's under a lot of pressure politically. And so I think, you know, while they both might want a deal in the long run, they're not going to get a real comprehensive deal, at least not this week.
Well, that's the thing, isn't it, Gershon Baskin? Because they could get a ceasefire, but a permanent end to the war is quite another matter, isn't it?
I wouldn't push it off the table. I think that we've been putting pressure on the Trump administration, on his people, to make sure that it is a comprehensive deal. It could be done. Netanyahu is in a political game here, as Sarah said. It's true, and a complete deal could risk his government from breaking up. But Netanyahu is also riding high on his own belief that the public is behind him, and he might be willing to risk going to new elections now. He's been running a lot of polls. The Israeli political map is beginning to reshape itself. Netanyahu is confident enough to believe that his political wizardry would win him another victory.
Sarah Yerkes, your response to that?
I mean, I think that what everything Gershon's saying is correct, but at the same time, I just don't think that Trump and Netanyahu are coming from the same place. I don't think that they have the same incentives. So I think Trump just wants a splashy headline, and he's willing to not actually achieve something that's going to be long-term and lasting for either the Israelis or the Palestinians.
Gershon Baskin, where does this leave the wider Middle East? For example, Iran, because you get the sense that Israel is itching to have another go there in the future.
Well, I think it's too early to know the damage that was done to the Iranian nuclear program. The Iranian prime minister today said that president said that they never had a plan for a nuclear bomb. The Israelis don't believe that, and they believe that their enrichment program could renew quite quickly. President Trump has indicated that he believes that their program has been decimated, but very few people in the region share that estimation. So the Iranian threat is still there. What's not there are the Iranian proxies that have been hitting Israel, whether it be Hezbollah or Syria or even Hamas, which is pretty much decimated.
Sarah Yerkes, I mean, do you think that Netanyahu could win support from Trump in this meeting? Support in principle, I guess, in future to sort of finish the job in Iran, if you assume that, what Gershon Baskin said is correct, that the nuclear capabilities have been downgraded but not destroyed?
Absolutely. I think for both Trump and Netanyahu, what we've seen is they haven't achieved their goals in Iran. And despite what they might say publicly, the sort of bravado that we won, this was a victory, I think they both, certainly Netanyahu doesn't believe that the job has been finished. And so I think that is one of the main things on his agenda for this visit, is to convince Trump that it's not over, that maybe they won the first round, but there will be another fight at some point. It might be years away, it might be days away, it might be months away. But from Netanyahu's position, there needs to be more to ensure that Iran does not maintain those nuclear capabilities, and Trump seems to be on the side of Netanyahu here.
And Gershon, is the biggest stumbling block to signing something here in the next few days, is it the humanitarian aid issue and this controversial American-backed humanitarian aid foundation? Is that the problem, the biggest problem to surmount?
No, the biggest problem is the political problem on the Israeli side. One of the American who are very involved in the negotiations said to me, we've been told that a complete comprehensive deal would put the Netanyahu government at risk. Now, I don't understand why American negotiators concerned with the internal Israeli politics and the lifeline of Netanyahu's government. This is the biggest obstacle. It has been the obstacle for more than a year. When a deal has been on the table, Hamas has agreed to release all the hostages on the condition that the war end and Israel withdraws from Gaza. This is more complex now than the humanitarian aid issue. That can be resolved. It's not that big a problem.
Sarah, briefly, is the day after what happens, who governs Gaza? Is that one of the biggest stumbling blocks in your view?
I don't think it's nearly as big as the Israeli political issue, as Gershon said. I mean, I think this is absolutely the difference between a Trump presidency and perhaps a Biden or Obama presidency, that the Trump administration does want to see Netanyahu stay in power. They are their friend, they're their ally. That was not as big of a concern to a Biden or an Obama. And so I think that this is where, the U.S. is far more concerned about Israeli domestic politics than perhaps they normally would be.
Sarah Yerkes, Gershon Baskin, thank you both very much.